So in this video, we're going to have a look at some of the more classical theories of international trade. And the first that we're going to have a look at is known as mercantilism. Now, this is a 16th century economic philosophy that emerged in England, so it is quite old-fashioned in that sense, and is based around the idea that national wealth is based on accumulated wealth in things like gold and silver, which are, of course, the currency of trade at that particular time, which makes it, of course, very popular with people like Goldmember here from Austin Powers. Given all of that, the idea, the key premise behind mercantilism was for governments to maximize holdings through a trade surplus, which is, of course, when you have a situation where exports in a particular country or going out of a particular country are greater than the imports coming in. With that being the case, mercantilism viewed the role of government as having two key functions. First of all, to maximise exports through the use of subsidies, which is effectively, as we'll talk about in coming weeks, propping up and supporting your local exporters through the use of incentives and benefits and financial support. And also to minimise imports, on the other hand, through tariffs and quotas, which, as we'll talk about in the coming weeks, are effectively additional taxes that are imposed on imports, which make them more expensive and therefore less attractive to local consumers. So certainly the overall idea here was revolving around this idea of protectionism, that governments should be exist and should be there to support the local producers and protect them against potentially cheaper foreign importers. Some of the key ideas around mercantilism are quite important to understand here, and perhaps the most prominent of all is that it views trade as a zero-sum game. Now, unfortunately, zero-sum that we're talking about here has got nothing to do with the Japanese manga comic. We're talking about this idea that for one country to win, so to speak, in international trade, somebody has to lose, and that eventually each will balance each other out. I think this is probably best portrayed in an example. So imagine, for argument's sake, that Australia has a trade surplus with Indonesia. That is, our exports are greater than the value of our imports. This will mean that we have an inflow of revenue, since our exports are doing well overseas and foreign consumers in Indonesia are purchasing our exports, which means profits are being brought back into Australia, which increases the supply of money in Australia and leads to inflation, given that, of course, when you have a higher supply of money, each individual unit of currency is worth less, therefore you need to increase the prices to maintain that same value for the local producer, which of course leads to higher prices and inflation. The opposite, in theory at least, will occur in Indonesia, where you see the outflow of money to pay for imports, reducing the money supply in Indonesia. There are less of that local currency left as the money is going back to Australia in the form of profits from the sale of exports within Indonesia, and therefore we see prices fall. So the opposite of inflation, when you have less money, each individual unit of currency is worth more, therefore the forces of supply and demand dictate that the prices will be able to be reduced and maintain that same value. Indonesians will then, at least according to this idea of a zero-sum game, then purchase less Australian goods, given that they're now more expensive due to inflation, and Australians will start to buy more Indonesian goods, given that they're now relatively cheaper. This in turn leads to a decrease in the Australian balance of trade, since we now have more imports being sold, which means more money going back out of the country, back to Indonesia, and less money being brought into Australia from the reduced purchasing of exports in Indonesia. Until eventually we end up in the situation where the Australian trade surplus is eliminated, and the trade deficit in Indonesia is also eliminated, and we end up with this idea of a zero-sum game. That is, that they've balanced each other out in the long term. So this is a key idea to understand that underpins the whole premise of mercantilism. Despite the fact that it is quite an outdated notion, given that it was invented back in the 16th century, some of these key principles of mercantilism do still exist in the form of what we now call Neo-Mercantilism, and unfortunately this has got nothing to do with our friend from the Matrix. We're talking about an updated, slightly at least more contemporary approach to these same ideals. So again, neo-mercantilism, like its forebearer, equates political power with economic power, and in turn economic power with a balance of trade surplus. So the same idea here. It's designed therefore to simultaneously boost exports and at the same time limit imports. And we do see a number of examples of this still occurring even to this day all around the world. So traditionally here in Australia, a number of the manufacturing industries like textiles and clothing, footwear, and certainly the automotive industry have had significant protection from the government in terms of subsidies for the local producers and potentially, or at certain times at least, high levels of import quotas, tariffs, and so on to make it easier for those local competitors and producers to compete against the cheaper importers. China has also deliberately kept its currency relatively low for a long period of time against the US dollar for the exact same reason, to protect its local producers. And certainly if we have a look over in America at the moment, this man here has had many of his arguments based around neo-mercantilist perspectives. This whole idea of making America great again by protecting the local producers from these harmful overseas competitors is absolutely built around neo-mercantilist ideals. And certainly his decision to remove the US from a lot of free trade agreements is also in accordance with these ideals.